Yeah, if you can take me on to my first slide, please. Yeah, so just to give a bit of context to the 2020 season, we've had this, extreme drought. So that's obviously affected our spring crops and led to, quite uneven emergence in some cases. And the rain that we've got now has come, in good time to help, but not adequate to really lift that poor emergence we saw at the beginning. Obviously, that very dry position has meant quite low levels of foliar disease in the spring crop. The Ramularia risk is obviously still in front of us. The main risk coming from this point onwards. Certainly in the winter crop, we've seen very little as yet. So again, that dry spring has been helpful in terms of minimising Ramularia risk. But we're sitting against, it's been a very difficult season, and this kind of experience of extremes in our cropping is, sadly becoming more and more common. So that backdrop that we've got as well of, an increasing drive to pick up more sustainable practices, which we know we're needing to do because we've got issues with resistance and, quite rapid evolution of resistance in some diseases. And of course, the big thing that we had to deal with this year in the barley crop and elsewhere was the withdrawal of chlorothanols. So I'll pick up on that, particularly in the Ramularia context, in the rest of my talk. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, this just illustrates the law of averages. So the average rainfall tells you absolutely nothing. And, we had that extreme wet autumn and over the winter. So the winter crop, we actually had some disease coming in the back end. But that very, very dry spring, there's a sad little spring barley crop there, where again, sort of quite typically the edges of the fields have been poor to emerge. So we're back to wet conditions again now, certainly in the north here, torrential rainfall yesterday. So again, that's very characteristic of the climate we're in now, where we tend to stick in particular weather patterns for quite long periods. And then moving on to next slide. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're dealing with in barley is the fact that we're, in wheat, we're quite focused on septoria, and rust, yellow rust keeps us, on our toes. But on barley, we're often dealing with multiple disease targets. So commonly, Rhynchosporium, net blotch there, Ramularia, mildew. We've got brown rust as an issue. We've got the stem-based diseases. So we're often targeting, multiple diseases in the varieties we're working with. But the plus is we're still working with a greater number of active groups. So the strobilurins are still very much in play on the barley crops, with activity against, net blotch and Rhyncho, for example. And the other feature is we're clearly on a lower number of sprays and lower doses in the barley crop. So we still have a number of pluses in our fungicide usage there. We do, however, have that slow uptake of more disease-resistant varieties, and often that's very market-driven. So clearly, when we were very much focused on a distilling market and the only variety was Concerto, that drove behaviours. So we had very weak varieties, in most of the acreage. But we're now in a position where we're picking up slightly more disease-resistant varieties. So, even something like Laurietta's a 6, a lot of your high-yielding spring barley varieties carry quite good, or at least improved Rhynchosporium resistance. And for the spring barleys, we still are working broadly on a palette of 9s for mildew, which is really good. Ramularia, though, to come back to this one, is the really tricky one here. So it has that horrible history of fungicide resistance. It was the first to develop resistance to the strobilurins. It quietly developed resistance to MBCs, even though we never really used them to target Ramularia. We had emerging issues with SDHIs. We had field failures with the azoles, starting in the 2014 period, and then that really concerning fall off in the activity of azole and SDHI chemistry in 2017. So I'll kind of pick up on where we're at with that palette today. But I mean, that was really the backdrop for why we were so concerned about the withdrawal of chlorothalonil in the spring barley program. So next slide. Yeah. So coming back, I mean, this loss of chemistry, it's particularly welcome to have something new, and there are a number of new products starting to appear, which is very encouraging. So you've heard lots about Revastar today. I don't need to pick up on much of this, um, but yes, it's a step forward, and I'll come on to some results in the spring barley crop when it comes to Ramularia. We can use it on feed crops right up until 69, so that's excellent. It's still capped at growth stage 45 if you're going for brewing or distilling. But like I say, that it does give us a new tool in the spring barley crop. So next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about how we can really sustainably use our fungicides, clearly a major tool is we're thinking about the varieties, but beyond that, we're thinking about when we can most efficiently target those inputs. So this thing about trying to take out the the sprays that are only marginally profitable. And we know that barley is very driven by the number of tillers you hang on to, and hence the number of grain sites. But actually, we're now in a position in the spring crop, that very important T1 timing in the winter crop, in the spring crop where we've now got more disease-resistant varieties. And, in a year like this where it's very dry, there's actually quite good evidence now that you really can minimize that early spray. And it's that growth stage 45 spray, the booting onward spray, which we're using for Ramularia, which is the really key one to keep the green leaf towards the end of the season. So that's slightly different to when we were working on the weaker varieties where that insurance early in the season was so important. But certainly we can take out the very marginal, the T3s and barley and things like that. So next slide, please. This is some of the data that we've got that's kind of backing up what I've just said. So I've kind of illustrated the power of varietal resistance in terms of the amount of disease that develops. So we've had quite a run. We've had 3 years of trials over multiple sites, looking at various treatments where we take a T2 approach or we take out the T1. And really what this is illustrating, we've got a concerto here at our Lanark site last year. Now, this is a site that's wet where disease, Rhynchosporium, really fires up. So you can see there the amount of Rhynchosporium on leaf 6 and 7 early in the season there. And then you're moving into the growth stage 78 assessment. So you can see really high levels of Rhynchosporium on the untreated leaves in those crops. You can see what a T2 alone has done in that situation. So it's been moderately successful, but this is a scenario where having a T1 and 2 has been powerful. But then if we move on to the next slide, we're looking at fairing here. So again, a much stronger Rhynchosporium variety. So here you can see that there are only traces of Rhynchosporium in the crop at that 31 timing. And regardless of what we did, there's nothing in the crop at growth stage 78. So that varietal thing is really a very strong tool. And we're still only really exploring in practice how best we tune fungicide programs to match the varietal resistance that we're working with. So next slide, please. These are the fungicide performance curves that you're also familiar with, but it illustrates the chemistry that we've got for Rhynchosporium. So we see there some of the straight products on the right. You've got an azole in Proline, you've got strobilurins, as I said, still in play, and then you've got the SDHIs. So that is a good position to be in. It lets us mix, alternate, and really steward chemistry rather than being over-reliant. And on the left there, you see some of the mixed products. So we've got 2 azole SDHI mixes, and we've got Priaxor, so a strobilurin SDHI mix. So that's a good position to be in. We know with Rhynchosporium, like so many diseases, we're much better working protectantly. So again, it's working with your variety and anticipating what the risk is. And if I could have the next slide. Net blotch is one where we're seeing an erosion in efficacy due to resistance. In the fungicide performance work, we had a try there with Kayak, just to see if it could bring a bit of alternation. It's nice early in the winter barley crops, but you can see there it's not going to be a lot of help in net blotch. But again, you see the power of the mixed chemistry there for net blotch. So we're in quite a good position when it comes to managing that in barley. And then the next slide, please. Now we get on to Ramularia again. So you hear the drop in my voice where this is the tricky one. Um, but the encouraging thing here, I mean, yes, we can see the power of Bravo of chlorothalonil sitting in that very strong corner of the chart here. So low dose is doing a good job. You see where Proline sits. So we still have retained efficacy in that azole. And then you see Revastar, so much stronger than the prothioconazole, not quite as good as the chlorothalonil, but it's about halfway between. So that's good news in one context if we pluck the good news from a bad news story. And if I could have the next slide, please. So, I mean, we know what Ramularia can do. It's attacking the barley crops. It's producing a toxin, which is then giving the damage to the leaves. And you can see there the halo effect that, round the lesions in that illustration. And that loss of leaves is reducing yield and quality. And, we estimate the annual losses in the UK about £10 million. So it's a significant problem, and we're definitely in a riskier scenario now than we were. So the next slide. It really has been a lesson in how not to manage a disease. So our varieties to date have been weak. We had no history of resistance. We used to talk about chariot spot. So it came through on that sort of background family history. And we've still got quite a lot of that. Bill, I'm sure, will pick up on this, but we've a lot of that shared heritage still in our current varieties. And we tended to grow, single varieties over large acreages. So we relied on our fungicides, and, we've managed to erode and break them fairly well. So the next slide takes us on to what we know about the Ramularia life cycle. So it is a really complex disease. I've often said it's really evolved every trick in the book to hang on in there. Inherently, it's not that strong a pathogen, but it's just very cunning. So starting in that top left corner, we know it's seed-borne. It's carried, parent crop to daughter crop. It's then moving in the very young seedlings, and it's moving below the plant's radar between the cells. It's using the moisture between the cells to help it move as well. So it then starts to move up into the plant. Again, the dry spring this year has helped to reduce, we hope, the amount of Ramularia that's moving up into those upper leaves. But actually, it's not entirely driven by just the amount of Ramularia that's in a plant. It's so strongly driven in terms of the symptoms by the stresses on the crop that trigger it to then move into that spot forming phase. So those stress triggers are really a key part of what will drive the symptoms that we will see this year. We see it right through onto the heads, and again, that's where it carries back into the seeds. And we're fairly sure it has a secondary stage on straw. So it's reproducing sexually, which is why we get that rapid evolution of resistance. And it's just another way that it hangs on. There's a little bit of evidence that minimum tillage in the winter crop is a small driver. So it's another feature in this really complex pathogen. And if I could have the next slide. Yeah, so these are where we're starting to think about the risk factors for Ramularia leaf spot. We know that stress crops show more disease, and clearly we don't set out to deliberately stress our crops, but we know that some complex chemical mixtures can be one of the stresses that we can avoid. The others are less within our control, so high temperature and lots of rainfall certainly encourage the disease. And we know that bursts of sunlight, high light levels activate the fungal toxins in the leaves. So there's an illustration there of the toxin vesicles within the Ramularia pathogen. So some of the sow dates that we know about, again, in the winter crop, early drilling is sometimes a feature. There's some evidence, like I say, that minimum tillage can enhance the risk. previous crops, so a lot of barley in the rotation and a lot of barley straw, again, is a small risk factor. The cumulative temperature through the season, which has an effect on senescence. We were talking about leaf area earlier today. So that cumulative warm temperatures are certainly a feature in driving Ramularia. Rainfall over the summer, so again, that wetness at the end of the season, bursts of sunlight, and the presence of other diseases are another stress. And again, that's one of the stresses that we can probably manage better than others. So it's a complex one. There's not one single thing that we can say this is the pointer for whether we have a bad year. So if I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, the presence of other diseases. We've got some good pictures here from trials. Rhynchosporium remains the biggest yield robber and the one that we really have to worry about. But like I say, we can think more carefully and more focused ways about the risk there. Mildew, so a problem in varieties like Propino where there is, it's one of the spring barley varieties that doesn't have a 9, but it's relatively rare in our other varieties. And brown rust is another one that we see quite commonly in the spring barley crops. But again, rusts are one of the pleasanter diseases, if you like, in that they're more easily managed by chemistry. And once we're within programs, we get good control of brown rust in spring barley crops. So, like I say, these can be stresses on the crop, and they are ones that we can manage. And then, we can think about Ramularia at the T2 timing. So if I could have the next slide. Identification is one of the things that we're really pushing for people. So we still get an awful lot of people saying they've got Ramularia and they don't. It's other spots and stresses. So these 5 Rs have been quite widely circulated now, but it's that distinctive reddish colouring. That rectangular look is really distinctive to Ramularia. That ring of chlorosis around it where it's drawing nutrients from the leaf. It tends to be restricted by the leaf veins, which is why you get that rectangular shape. And the really key one, the really easy one, again, if you flip the leaf over and it looks the same on the back, then that's more likely to be Ramularia. A lot of the other stresses and the sun scorches tend to show on the top side, but when you flip it over, they're not there. So that's identification. And that, if you're out walking crops and just building your own awareness of what your risk on the farm is, which fields are bad, that can help your forward knowledge of how much you have to worry about Ramularia going forward. So if I could have the next slide. Yeah, we've been working on Ramularia for a long time and testing all the available options. This is results from last year from a winter barley trial. But we've had a number of quite low Ramularia years in the trials. So data can be somewhat sketchy, but what you can pick out here, we've got Bravo control sitting there. And I should say there's a totally untreated sitting right to the left there. And we've got an untreated at T2 sitting along to the right there. So that's really what you're comparing these treatments to. You can see Bravo looking well there, the azole proline looking well, and bear in mind that we know that Revastar is an improvement on proline, so that's good. What you see in this one, though, is a range of other options. So clearly a lot of chat about Folpit, an alternative multi-site there. Not as good as chlorothalonil and not as good as the azoles. And certainly our own trial work show it's erratic. So sometimes it brings efficacy and sometimes not. And that unpredictability is harder to manage in terms of using a product. We've got Mancozeb sitting beside that there now. That's not approved on barley, but again, it's not adding a lot there. It's not giving us significant control there. What you see there is some odd effects from some of the other chemistry where there appears to be an effect as well in Ramularia. So some chemistry we know helps in de-stressing the crop, and certainly we know that other chemistry has negative effects. So we always knew that with the morpholines, they were hot and they actually enhanced Ramularia. So again, that comes back to not using overly complex mixes and stressing the crop, which is a rather negative piece of advice, but it's advice nonetheless. If I could have the next slide there, please. This is just showing you the yields from the same trial, so broadly reflecting the specific weight, 1,000 grain weight benefits and the yield benefits that we get from those treatments. So if I can move on to the next slide. Really, concluding our current advice, the varietal ratings from the HDB lists have been withdrawn. So we're in a very uncertain position when it comes to good advice on varietal help with Ramularia. That is going to be a longer term game. So we are where we are at the moment with the varieties we've got. Certainly, we know that the T2 booting and early ear spray is much more effective than the earlier sprays. So there's sometimes an effect from your T1 sprays, but it really is about what you do at T2 in terms of managing Ramularia. We've got that residual efficacy in prothioconazole. So in terms of where we're at in the here and now, it's azole chemistry. We know that Revastar is an improvement on that. So that's encouraging, and it's sitting midway between where we were with chlorothalonil and prothioconazole. Now, clearly, it's not ideal that we're sitting on one piece of chemistry to manage a disease like Ramularia, but there is other chemistry we hope following on in a few years, which will bring something back. But clearly, we don't want to over-rely on that. We're doing a lot of work with the other multi-sites I've said, but also with biostimulants and micronutrients to see if they can play a greater role. Now, there's an awful lot of products sitting in that category of biostimulants and micronutrients. And at the moment, you can't make plant protection claims unless that's been fully demonstrated. But certainly there is some evidence that, again, in minimising the stress on spring barley crops, we can reduce the Ramularia risk. But it's still very early days for that type of chemistry and that type of approach. So really where we're at the moment is in recognising and building awareness of risk and continuing to work with these other options. So I'm thinking that was my last slide. Since I'm not driving, I'll ask for the next slide to be popped up. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Fiona. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts. We've had quite a few questions come in. The first one commenting on resistance ratings, and they've asked what progress on resistance ratings can you talk about? And this is obviously particularly important in the light of the loss of CTL. So have you got any comments on that?
Yes, I mean, I tried to build that into my concluding statements there, that really we're not in a very good position when it comes to varietal resistance at the moment. There's still a lot of that common heritage that is weak to Ramularia in the present varieties. It is an area where we're working very hard. My colleague Neil Havis, in seasons where it was easier to travel, was going round all the variety sites, all the RL sites to build up that picture. But I can't bring anything new to the party today and do a big reveal and say there's something great, I'm afraid. I hope Bill will pick up on that in the next talk.
Okay, and maybe one for either Scott or Fiona. Have you seen much disease pressure on spring barley so far, and what's been the main disease? And what do you what do you think is going to be dominant this year?
Shall I go first, Scott?
Yeah.
It's been, because it's been so dry, there's been very little disease in the spring barley crops. I've put my life on the line here by saying it's lower risk of Ramularia. So I hope that follows through. We have seen some disease starting to pick up in the winter barley crops. So again, levels there were low, but the recent rain has given a small lift there. Like I say, in a normal season, Brinco's the one that's the big yield robber and the ones we have to worry about. But it's not a disease, a particularly high disease pressure year.
Well, I would certainly have to agree with Fiona, because I haven't seen any crops because I've been under lockdown. But the feedback of the feedback from growers and also some of the trials results that we've had back would indicate that disease pressure has been lower this year. but there's a long way to go.
Indeed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've maybe got time for one more question. There was one that came in. Given how cost effective CTL was on spring barley, what are the remaining options like? I guess it's been covered a little bit, but is there anything else you wanted to stress, either of you?
No, I mean, that again, chlorothalonil was cheap and effective, and we don't have that again. But the retained efficacy in the azole chemistry is really the best approach at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, I would also just add in what Fiona already stressed about reducing stress within the crop early on, i.e. control wrinkle and net blotch, look at micronutrients, nutrition, anything that will reduce stress within the crop. And we've done a lot of work this year again with Revistar on Ramularia control, and it is offering the best levels of control on the market at the moment now that chlorothalonil has gone.
And there's been one more interesting question just come in about a T3 application. It could be a late year for disease coming in this year. So would a T3 be worth it for grain quality on their best malting barley crops? Would you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of T3 sprays on the barley crop. I mean, it is difficult where we move into a wet summer like this, and traditionally we don't directly target the ear on barley. Very occasionally we will see a small yield benefit in winter barley crops, but never in the spring crop. So getting in ahead of Ramularia, which tends to be the major stress there, is flowering. So you're looking at, that sort of early year emergence as being the ideal timing. And the later ones, partly you're reduced in terms of what chemistry you can apply. But yeah, these are the ones I think, if we're thinking sustainably, we can take out.